Hi, dear Bert. Camp Devens is near Boston and has about 50,000 men, or did have, before this epidemic broke loose. It also has the base hospital for the Division of the Northeast. This epidemic started about 4 weeks ago and has developed so rapidly that the camp is demoralized and all ordinary work is held up until it has passed. All assemblages of soldiers are taboo. These men start with what appears to be an attack of low grip or influenza, and when brought to the hospital, they very rapidly develop the most vicious type of pneumonia that has ever been seen. 2 hours after admission, they have the mahogany spots over the cheekbones, and a few hours later, you can begin to see the cyanosis extending from their ears and spreading all over their face, until it's hard to distinguish the colored men from the white. It is only a matter of a few hours then, until death comes, and it is simply a struggle for air until they suffocate. It is horrible. One can stand it to see 1, 2, or 20 men die, but to see these poor devils dropping like flies sort of gets on your nerves. We've been averaging about 100 deaths per day, and still keeping it up. There is no doubt in my mind that there's a new mixed infection here, but what, I do not know.
On April 6, 1917, America entered World War I. At the time, America possessed the 17th largest army in the world. To prepare itself for the war, America would undergo massive mobilization. Every aspect of society became mobilized for the war effort, and with the Selective Service Act, large numbers of troops began pouring into training camps from every corner of the country. America was preparing itself for war. But these camps had an unwelcome visitor, a deadly virus that would make its home amongst the mobilizing American troops. The very conditions of mobilization would create the perfect recipe for an epidemic, and it came to be called Spanish influenza. As this virus spread through the military, America would prove to be both unprepared and unwilling to take the appropriate measures to stop the spread of the flu in the face of wartime pressures. No one knows the true origin of Spanish influenza. The first record in the U.S. was in March of 1918. Camp Funston was a military training camp located near Junction City, Kansas. Alongside the regular staff, the men of U.S. Army 89th Division, which numbered 40,000, were crowded into the camp for training. The sheer mass of troops soon proved an excellent starting point for one of the first outbreaks of knock-me-down fever, or what would later be known as the first wave of influenza. Soldiers reported fevers, headaches, backaches, and other general flu symptoms. However, they also made quick recoveries, normally only incapacitated for 2 or 3 days. And despite having 233 cases in March and 48 flu-related deaths, Army doctors didn't see the infection as a threat. The medical corps was more concerned with the spread of measles than it was with the seasonal flu. They were convinced the flu would pass as it did every year. And at the end of spring 1918, relatively few flu incidents were reported. By early August, it seemed that the flu had disappeared altogether. However, the flu would soon be back and stronger than ever. Sometime during mid-August, the flu mutated into a dangerous killer. By the end of August, Camp Devens in Massachusetts was affected. The camp was massively overcrowded. 45,000 men called Camp Devens home at the time when it was only meant to house 35,000. It became the perfect breeding ground for this new strain flu. On September 7th, a soldier of Company B, 42nd Infantry, reported to the infirmary. The doctors misdiagnosed him, believing that the flu could not produce such symptoms. The regular symptoms of flu were present, but many were in the extreme. Fevers soared, orifices bled. Coughing could become so violent as to rupture stomachs and break ribs. Worse still, the infection had a high likelihood of developing pneumonia. Perhaps the strangest aspect of this flu was that it attacked the young and healthy, particularly those of the age subject to the draft. Mobilization had taken those most susceptible and placed them in a perfect breeding ground for the flu. On September 8th, a dozen more men of Company B arrived at the infirmary. By the 16th, other companies and regiments began sending sick soldiers to the infirmary. By September 23rd, 12,604 cases had been reported at Camp Devens. The camp hospital, which was only meant to house 2,000 patients, was quickly packed with over 8,000 sick men. As many as 90 could die in a day, and the camp found itself struggling to find room for the infected living and the increasing dead. By October, over 17,000 had contracted the disease, and 787 had died from it. The U.S. military was beginning to realize that they were losing men before they ever made it to the front lines. This was a sickness that could incapacitate a unit or division better than a human enemy, and what was worse was that it was spreading. The U.S. military wouldn't slow down to stop the infection. It had a war to win, and continued to mobilize soldiers throughout the U.S. Like wildfire, flu spread from camp to camp before proper travel bans could be put in place. The plague traveled north by railroad as a group of reinforcements were sent from Camp Devens to Camp Upton, Long Island, New York on September 13th. This camp was the stepping-off point for U.S. troops heading to France. Within days of the troops' arrival, Camp Upton was infected, and hundreds of soldiers soon became sick. The camp commander put out a quarantine, stopping anyone from entering or leaving except on urgent business. Unfortunately, the pressures of war stopped this quarantine from being effective, as all too often military business was considered urgent. The flu continued its spread throughout the military, appearing next in Camp Grant, Rockford, Illinois. As if a switch had been flipped, troops suddenly became ill, with 70 troops being admitted on Saturday, September 21st. This number would continue to increase to a high of 787 admissions on September 29th. The flu overwhelmed all the staff, pushing them to their limits. Barracks had to be converted to medical wards, increasing sick beds from 10 to over 4,000 in just 6 days. Medical personnel caught the flu, and some became very sick. Yet just as the flu admissions began to subside, pneumonia began to take hold. The death toll soared. By October 1st, it exceeded double digits on a daily basis. By the 5th of October, it had climbed over 100 deaths a day. The mounting deaths took their toll on the camp, overwhelming facilities and staff. The camp, built the previous year, was designed to handle 4 dead bodies a day. The corpses began to pile up. With no other way to deal with the bodies, officials made deals with undertakers to haul them away at $50 apiece. These camps were only the beginning. The flu had reached the West Coast by October, infecting Camp Fremont near Palo Alto, California, on the 8th, and Camp Lewis, south of Tacoma, Washington, on the 9th. Quarantine methods were put in place, but they often were ineffective. Acting Army Surgeon General Charles Richard sought to control the spread of the flu by stopping movement in and out of infected camps. His plans would also have slowed troop movements to France by lowering troopship capacity by 50% and starting a week-long quarantine before the voyage. His quarantine plan would have brought mobilization to a near halt, protecting soldiers from infection, but crippling the war effort. The Army Chief of Staff Peyton March was only willing to slow mobilization slightly, and thus only enacted some of Richard's plans. He was soon questioned by President Wilson as to why he had not implemented better quarantine methods. His reasoning was that troop movements to the front or even inside the country could not be stopped or the Germans would take it as a sign of weakness. The war effort superseded all other concerns, and President Wilson deferred to his judgment. The flu spread throughout the whole military and ran its course in 8 weeks, ending around late November 1918, while affecting individual camps for up to 4 weeks. Infected U.S. troops moved into the European theater, and there continued to suffer from the flu, along with other armies during the ending months of the war. Before the virus died out, the influenza epidemic took the lives of over 24,000 servicemen, would reach all corners of the globe, killing untold millions and becoming one of the worst pandemics in human history.
Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun. Take it on the run, on the run, on the run. Hear them calling.